The massive glass dome of the Galactic Military Academy stretched across the horizon of Nexus Prime like a crystal mountain. Inside its walls, the greatest military minds from across the galaxy gathered to learn the art of war. Students came from hundreds of different worlds, each bringing their own ideas about how battle should be fought. Commander Vel walked through the main hall with his 4 arms crossed behind his back. His blue skin showed the calm patterns that meant he was thinking deeply. As an Altarian, he had spent most of his life studying war. His people were known throughout the galaxy as the best teachers of military strategy. Today, however, he felt worried about something that had never happened before. The Academy's greatest challenge was the Grand Strategy Simulation. It was more than just a game or a test. The simulation showed a real war that had been going on for 10 years of computer time. 3 huge groups of planets fought each other across thousands of star systems. Millions of digital soldiers died every day in battles that seemed to have no end. Every month, new groups of students tried to solve the simulation. They came from the smart Catherian Empire, where mathematics ruled everything. They came from the strong Zentari Confederation, where honor in battle was the highest goal. They came from dozens of other civilizations, each sure that their way of thinking would finally end the endless war. None of them had ever succeeded. The simulation room was the size of a football field. Holographic displays showed space battles, ground wars, and political meetings happening all at the same time. Blue dots represented one army, red dots showed another, and green dots marked the third faction. Between them, yellow lines showed trade routes, supply ships, and communication networks that kept the war machine running. Commander Vel stopped in front of the main display. The current state of the war looked exactly like it had 6 months ago. The blue faction controlled the industrial worlds in the north. The red faction held the agricultural planets in the south. The green faction owned the mining systems in the east. None of them could defeat the others, but none of them would give up either. "Sir?" Lieutenant Kex approached with a datapad in his lower hands. His insect-like features showed the nervous twitching that meant he had important news. "The new student group has arrived." Vel took the datapad and read the information. His skin patterns shifted to show surprise, then concern, then something that might have been fear. "They are from Earth?" "Yes, sir. 3 of them." "Only 3?" Vel looked at the massive simulation again. Most student groups had 20 or 30 members. The Catherian team sometimes brought 50 mathematicians and computer experts. "Are you sure this is correct?" "The paperwork is complete, sir. They passed all the entrance tests." Kex paused, his antenna twitching with worry. "Sir, I have heard stories about Earth." Everyone in the galaxy had heard stories about Earth. It was a death world, a planet so dangerous that simply being born there was considered a miracle. The humans who lived on Earth faced deadly weather, poisonous animals, and diseases that would kill most other species in hours. Their own planet seemed to be trying to murder them every single day. Most civilized species thought humans were either very brave or completely insane. "Where are they now?" Vel asked. "In the briefing room, sir." They requested to start immediately. Vel's skin showed the orange patterns of amusement. Most new student groups spent weeks studying the simulation before they even tried to understand it. They read history books, analyzed political reports, and created detailed charts showing every army and every resource. The smart ones spent months preparing before they touched a single control. The briefing room was smaller than the simulation chamber, but still impressive. Holographic maps covered every wall, showing different parts of the Galactic War. Political information scrolled past in dozens of alien languages. Economic reports updated every few seconds with new data about trade and production. 3 humans sat at the center table, looking very small in the large room. The first human wore the uniform of a military captain. His name was Jake Morrison, and his file said he had fought in real battles at the edge of human space. His hair was gray at the edges, and his eyes moved constantly, watching everything around him like he expected an attack at any moment. The second human was a woman named Emma Torres. She held the rank of lieutenant, but her test scores were higher than most commanders in the galaxy. She stared at the holographic displays with complete focus, as if she was trying to memorize every detail. The third human was Tom Bradley, a sergeant who had worked with Special Forces on Earth. He sat in his chair like he was relaxing at home, but Vel noticed that his hands never stopped moving. His fingers tapped against the table in patterns that seemed random but probably were not. "Welcome to the Galactic Military Academy," Vel said in his most formal voice. "I am Commander Vel, and I will be overseeing your attempt at the grand strategy simulation." Jake stood up and gave a simple nod. "Thank you, Commander. We appreciate the opportunity. Have you had time to study the preliminary materials?" "We read the basic information on the ship," Emma said. Her voice was calm and professional. 10-year conflict, 3 major factions, resource-based warfare across multiple star systems. Vel felt his skin patterns shift to show confusion. The basic information was just a summary. Most students spent weeks studying the detailed reports. "You will need much more than the basic information to understand the simulation." "Maybe," Tom said with a small smile. "Or maybe the basic information is all we need." Other students began filling the observation areas around the briefing room. Word had spread quickly through the academy that the humans were going to attempt the simulation. Students from a dozen different species came to watch, most of them expecting to see a quick and entertaining failure. A group of young Cytherians whispered to each other in their mathematical language, making calculations about how long the humans would last. The Zentari cadets stood in formation, their warrior culture showing respect even for enemies they expected to defeat easily. Smaller groups from other species found places to watch the show. "The simulation has been running for 10 years of internal time," Vel explained, activating the holographic displays. "Every previous attempt has failed to find a resolution. The longest successful engagement lasted 4 months of real time before the student group requested additional resources." Jake walked around the table, looking at the displays from different angles. "What counts as success?" "Complete resolution of the conflict. All 3 factions must agree to lasting peace, or one faction must achieve total victory without causing galactic-scale destruction. Has anyone come close?" Emma asked. "The Cytherian team last year reduced active combat by 30% before the simulation reset due to their resource miscalculations," Vel admitted. "The Zentari attempt created the most dramatic military victories, but resulted in the destruction of 47 star systems." Tom's fingers continued their quiet tapping. "What are we not allowed to do?" The question surprised Vel. Most students asked what they were supposed to do, not what they could not do. "You must work within the established rules of the simulation. No hacking the computer systems, no changing the basic parameters, no actions that would be impossible in real warfare." "But anything that would be possible in real warfare is allowed?" Jake asked, of course. The 3 humans looked at each other for just a moment. Vel had seen thousands of student teams, and he had learned to read the silent communication that happened between team members. Most groups needed long discussions and detailed planning sessions. These humans seemed to understand each other. With just a glance. "We are ready to begin," Emma said. The observation areas filled with quiet laughter from alien students. 43 minutes of preparation time had to be some kind of record for the shortest planning session in Academy history. Vel felt his skin showing the patterns that meant he was concerned, but trying to be polite. "Are you certain?" Most successful teams spend several days studying the current state of the simulation before making any decisions. "We are certain," Jake said. Vel gestured toward the simulation chamber. As they walked through the corridors, he tried to explain the complexity of what they were about to face. Political relationships between hundreds of worlds, economic systems that controlled the flow of resources across the galaxy, military technologies that most species took decades to understand. The humans listened politely but did not ask any questions. In the simulation chamber, Vel activated the main controls and stepped back. The holographic displays came to life, showing the current state of the 10-year war in all its terrible complexity. Thousands of ships moved through space, millions of soldiers fought on distant planets, and politicians argued in council chambers. Across the galaxy, "The controls are now yours," Vel announced. Jake sat down at the command station and looked at the displays for exactly 12 seconds. Then he turned to his teammates and said something that made every alien observer stop laughing. "This is not actually a war," he said quietly. "This is a resource management problem." Jake's words hung in the air like a challenge. Every alien student in the observation area stopped their quiet conversations. Commander Vel's skin patterns shifted through several colors before settling on the deep purple that meant complete. Confusion. A resource management problem? Vel repeated slowly. "Captain Morrison, this is a military simulation. 3 galactic powers have been fighting for 10 years. Billions of lives are at stake." "Virtual lives," Tom corrected without looking up from his console. His fingers had stopped their rhythmic tapping and were now moving across the control interface with surprising speed. "And virtual resources being moved around according to mathematical rules." Emma stood up and walked to the nearest holographic display. She reached out and touched one of the blue dots representing a fleet of warships. The display zoomed in to show individual vessels, their weapon loadouts, and their supply requirements. Her eyes moved quickly across the information, reading numbers that most alien students would need hours to understand. "Interesting," she said quietly. "Each ship requires specific amounts of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. The computer calculates these needs automatically based on the ship's activities." "Of course it does," said a Catherian student from the observation area. His mathematical mind was insulted by the obvious statement. "Resource management is the foundation of all military operations. We have spent months calculating the optimal supply ratios." Emma turned to look at the young alien. "Did you calculate what happens when the supply ratios change?" "Change? Why would they change?" "The simulation parameters are fixed." "The parameters are fixed," Jake agreed, settling into his command chair. "But the conditions are not." He gestured to the massive display showing the entire war. "Look at this conflict. Really look at it." Commander Vel found himself staring at the display he had seen thousands of times before. The 3 factions controlled roughly equal amounts of territory. Their armies were balanced in strength. Their economies produced enough resources to maintain their military forces, but not enough to gain a decisive advantage. "It is a perfect stalemate," Vel said. "That is why no student group has ever solved it." "It is perfect," Tom agreed. "Too perfect. In real war, nothing stays balanced for 10 years. Someone gets lucky, someone makes a mistake, someone finds a new strategy. But this simulation has been stable for a decade because the computer is designed to maintain balance." The alien students began murmuring among themselves. The idea that the simulation might be designed to be unsolvable was disturbing. If that were true, then all their careful planning and strategic thinking was pointless. Emma returned to her console and began pulling up economic data. Charts and graphs filled the air around her, showing production rates, trade flows, and resource consumption across hundreds of star systems. The information was overwhelming, but she studied it with the same focused intensity she had shown during their brief planning session. "The blue faction controls 60% of the heavy industry," she said, talking more to herself than to anyone else. The red faction has 70% of the agricultural output. The green faction owns 80% of the rare metal mining operations. We know this already, called out a Zentari cadet. His warrior culture valued direct action over endless analysis. Every student group studies the resource distribution. The challenge is using that information to gain military advantage. No, Jake said firmly. The challenge is recognizing that military advantage is not the goal. He stood up and walked to the center of the room, where all three faction displays overlapped. His movement was casual, but every alien observer found themselves watching him with complete attention. There was something about the way humans moved that suggested danger, even when they appeared relaxed. Tom, show them the supply line analysis. Tom's console lit up with a network of yellow lines connecting star systems across the galaxy. The lines showed trade routes, supply convoys, and resource transfers that kept the three armies functioning. It looked like a spider web stretched across space, with critical junction points where multiple routes converged. Every military force in this simulation depends on a continuous flow of resources, Tom explained. Food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, communication equipment. Without these supplies, armies cannot fight. Obviously, muttered a Catherian mathematician. That is why we protect our supply lines and attack enemy supply lines. Basic military strategy. Basic strategy for fighting a war, Emma corrected. But what if the goal is not to fight a war? The observation area fell silent. The concept was so foreign to military thinking that most aliens could not process it. Wars were fought to achieve victory. Victory required defeating the enemy. Defeating the enemy required superior strategy, better weapons, or more resources. Commander Vel felt his skin patterns cycling rapidly through different colors. Captain Morrison, please explain what you mean. Jake returned to his console and activated a new display showing economic projections. The holographic charts showed what would happen to each faction's economy under different scenarios. Most of the projections involved military campaigns, territorial conquest, or resource capture. Every simulation run for the past 10 years has focused on helping one faction defeat the other two, Jake said. But look what happens when you run projections for scenarios where all three factions survive. The economic models shifted, showing entirely different possibilities. Instead of winner-takes-all outcomes, the charts displayed cooperative scenarios, trade agreements, and shared resource development projects. The numbers were surprising. In several projection models, cooperation produced better economic results for all three factions than military victory produced for any single faction. This is impossible, declared a senior Zentari officer who had been observing from the upper level. Military simulations are about conflict, not cooperation. You cannot solve a war by pretending the war does not exist. We are not pretending anything, Tom said calmly. We are recognizing that this war exists because the computer thinks it has to exist. Remove the conditions that make war necessary, and the war ends by itself. Emma had been quiet for several minutes, running calculations on her console. Now she looked up with the expression of someone who had discovered something important. The simulation's artificial intelligence is programmed to optimize for military efficiency. Each faction's AI tries to maximize its military power relative to its enemies. Correct, Vel confirmed. That is how military simulations work. But what if there were no enemies? The question hung in the air like an impossible riddle. Commander. Vel's skin showed the rapid color changes that indicated deep confusion. In his decades of military experience, the concept of war without enemies was meaningless. There are always enemies, he said finally. That is the nature of conflict. No, Jake said quietly. That is the nature of competition for limited resources. Change the resource equation, and you change the nature of the competition. Tom pulled up a new display showing the simulation's underlying mathematics. The equations were complex, but the basic logic was simple. Each faction's AI was programmed to compete for resources because the simulation assumed resources were limited. If Faction A gained something, Factions B and C had to lose something. Zero-sum thinking, Tom explained. For me to win, you have to lose. But what if we could create positive sum conditions? What if everyone could win? The alien students began talking excitedly among themselves. The idea was revolutionary, but it made logical sense. If the fundamental assumptions of the simulation could be changed, then the behavior of the factions would change as well. Emma stood up and walked to Jake's console. I need to verify something, she said, her fingers dancing across the controls. New data streams appeared, showing detailed breakdowns of each faction's resource needs and production capabilities. Look at this, she said, her voice rising with excitement. The blue faction has excess industrial capacity, but lacks rare metals. The green faction has more rare metals than they can use but needs manufactured goods. The red faction has agricultural surpluses but requires industrial equipment. Trade relationships, Vel said slowly. But the three factions are at war. They cannot trade with each other. They cannot trade because they are at war, Jake corrected. But they are at war because they cannot trade. It is a circular problem, with a simple solution. Tom leaned back in his chair and smiled. We break the circle. The observation area erupted in discussions as alien students tried to understand what the humans were proposing. The concept was so simple that it seemed impossible, yet so logical that it was hard to argue against. Commander Vel found himself staring at the simulation display with new eyes. For 10 years, student groups had approached the problem as a military exercise. They had focused on battles, strategies, and conquest. None of them had ever questioned whether the war itself was necessary. How do you propose to implement this theory? He asked. Jake, Emma, and Tom looked at each other again, with that same silent communication the aliens found so unsettling. In just a few seconds, they seemed to reach complete agreement about their next steps. We start by identifying the critical resource bottlenecks, Emma said. Then we create conditions where cooperation becomes more profitable than conflict, Tom added. And then we let the simulation's AI figure out the rest, Jake finished. The plan sounded impossibly simple, but the humans had already begun implementing it. Their consoles showed rapid-fire commands being entered into the simulation's control systems. They moved with the coordination of a team that had worked together for years, even though they had only met days before. In the observation areas, alien students pressed against the viewing windows to get a better look at what was happening. The humans were about to attempt something that had never been tried in the history of the Academy. They were going to try to end a war without fighting it. The simulation chamber filled with an electric tension as the humans began their work. Emma's fingers moved across her console like a pianist playing a complex song. Data streams flowed around her in glowing ribbons of information, showing resource flows, trade patterns, and economic dependencies that stretched across the galaxy. First bottleneck identified, she announced, highlighting a cluster of star systems on the main display. The Kepler mining complex. All three factions depend on rare earth elements from these systems, but they have been fighting over control for 3 years of simulation time. Tom nodded and pulled up tactical information about the mining complex. Heavy military presence from all three sides. The blue faction has 47 warships in the area. Red faction has 39. Green faction has 52. They are spending more resources protecting the mines than the mines actually produce. Jake studied the numbers with the expression of someone solving a simple math problem. Classic resource trap. All three sides lose money, but none of them can afford to withdraw because they fear the others will gain an advantage. Commander Vel watched from his observation position, his skin patterns showing growing confusion. But that is exactly why. This simulation is unsolvable. Every strategic resource is contested. No faction can gain decisive advantage. No faction can gain advantage through military conquest, Emma corrected. She was now working with 3 different holographic displays at once, comparing production data from dozens of star systems. But military conquest is not the only way to control resources. The alien students pressed closer to the viewing windows. In all the years of simulation attempts, no group had ever questioned the basic assumption that resources must be controlled through force. The humans were approaching the problem from an angle that seemed to violate fundamental military thinking. Tom began implementing what he called economic warfare without the warfare. His special forces background had taught him to identify critical infrastructure, but instead of planning to destroy it, he was analyzing how to make it more efficient. "Look at this," he said, projecting his analysis onto the main display. The Kepler mining complex is operating at 37% efficiency because the 3 factions keep disrupting each other's operations. Mining ships cannot extract resources effectively while dodging enemy patrols. Emma picked up the analysis and expanded it. If all 3 factions withdrew their military forces and instead contributed to a joint mining operation, they could increase resource extraction by 240%. More resources for everyone means less reason to fight, Jake added. But the simulation's AI will not consider joint operations because it is programmed to view the other factions as enemies. The humans had identified the core problem. The simulation's artificial intelligence was trapped in the same zero-sum thinking that had frustrated student groups for 10 years. Each faction's AI was designed to maximize its own advantage at the expense of its enemies, even when cooperation would benefit everyone. "How do you change the AI's programming?" asked a Kitherian student from the observation area. His mathematical mind was intrigued by the technical challenge. "We do not change the programming," Tom said with a smile. "We change the conditions that the programming responds to." Emma was already working on the solution. Her console showed complex economic models that traced the flow of resources through the simulation's trade networks. Most of the alien students could not follow her calculations, but they could see the results clearly enough. Every faction needs specific resources to maintain their military forces, she explained. But they also produce surpluses of other resources that they cannot use efficiently. The simulation's AI knows this, but cannot act on it because direct trade with enemies is prohibited by the war protocols. "So we create indirect trade opportunities," Jake said. Tom pulled up a new display showing neutral star systems that were not controlled by any of the 3 major factions. These systems had been largely ignored by previous student groups because they had limited military value. But the humans saw them differently. "Neutral trading posts," Tom explained. "The blue faction can sell their excess manufactured goods to neutral traders. Those same neutral traders can sell manufactured goods to the red and green factions. Everyone gets what they need without directly helping their enemies." The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. By using neutral intermediaries, the 3 factions could engage in beneficial trade without violating their war protocols. The simulation's AI would accept these transactions because they followed established rules for dealing with neutral parties. Emma began implementing the trading network with rapid-fire commands. Her economic training had taught her to think in terms of market forces and supply chains. Within minutes, she had created a complex web of trade relationships that connected all 3 factions through neutral intermediaries. "The AI will resist. At first," she warned. "It is programmed to be suspicious of anything that might benefit enemy factions." "Then we start small," Jake said. "Minor trades that clearly benefit each faction without obviously helping their enemies. Once the AI sees the advantages, it will expand the trading automatically." The humans began their economic experiment with tiny resource transfers. A small shipment of medical supplies from Blue Faction surplus to a neutral trading post. The same trading post selling similar medical supplies to Red Faction forces. The transactions were so small that they barely registered on the simulation strategic displays, but the results were immediate. Red Faction forces that received the medical supplies operated more efficiently. Their reduced casualties meant they needed fewer replacement soldiers, which freed up resources for other purposes. The improved efficiency showed up in the simulations. Performance metrics within minutes. The simulation's eye noticed the improvement and began looking for similar opportunities. It found them everywhere. Tom had been correct about the cascade effect. Once the AI started thinking in terms of efficiency rather than pure military advantage, it discovered hundreds of opportunities for beneficial trades. Resource surpluses that had been sitting unused became valuable trade goods. Production bottlenecks that had lasted for years were suddenly resolved by access to materials from neutral traders. The alien observers watched in fascination as the simulation began changing. In real time, trade routes that had been military targets became protected commercial pathways. Neutral systems that had been ignored became busy commercial centers. Most importantly, the massive military fleets that had been tied up protecting contested resources began to seem unnecessary. The AI is learning, Emma said with satisfaction. Each successful trade teaches it that cooperation can be more profitable than conflict. Commander Vell found his understanding of military strategy being challenged by what he was witnessing. But what prevents the factions from using increased resources to build larger armies and resume fighting? Economics, Jake said simply. Building armies is expensive. Trading is profitable. The simulation's AI will choose profitable activities over expensive ones unless it perceives a direct threat. Tom was monitoring the military displays, watching as the three factions began reducing their armed forces. They are discovering that large armies are not cost-effective when trade provides better security than military force. The transformation was happening faster than anyone had expected. The Blue Faction had begun converting military shipyards into commercial trading vessels. The Red Faction was reassigning agricultural worlds from military supply to civilian production. The Green Faction was opening mining operations to neutral contractors instead of maintaining expensive military protection. Emma pulled up a strategic overview showing the simulation's overall condition. Military spending across all three factions has decreased by 18% in the last 15 minutes. Civilian production has increased by 23%. Trade volume has grown by 41%. And no one has fired a shot, Tom added. The alien students began talking excitedly among themselves. The humans had achieved more progress in 20 minutes than most student groups managed in weeks of careful military planning. They had done it without conquering a single planet, destroying a single enemy ship, or winning a single battle. Jake stood up and stretched, looking completely relaxed despite the revolutionary changes happening around him. The hard part is over. Now we just need to help the process along. Help it along how? Commander Vell asked. Emma was already working on the answer. Her console showed projected outcomes for the next phase of their plan. We identify the remaining sources of conflict and create economic incentives for peaceful resolution. There are still territorial disputes, Tom noted, highlighting contested star systems on the main display. Border conflicts where all three factions claim the same resources. Joint development projects, Jake suggested. Instead of fighting over who controls a resource, they can share the development costs and split the benefits. The humans had moved beyond simple trade relationships to more complex forms of cooperation. They were essentially rewriting the rules of galactic politics without changing a single line of computer code. Instead, they were changing the economic conditions that drove political decisions. As the simulation continued to evolve, the alien observers began to understand what they were witnessing. The humans had not solved the military simulation by being better warriors. They had solved it by making war economically irrational. The three factions were discovering that cooperation produced better results than conflict. Trade was more profitable than conquest, and shared development was more efficient than territorial control. The simulation's AI was learning these lessons and applying them across hundreds of star systems. How long before complete resolution? Commander Vel asked. Emma checked her projections and smiled. At current rates of change, total cessation of hostilities in approximately 37 minutes. The simulation chamber hummed with energy as thousands of virtual star systems began responding to the humans' economic interventions. What had started as small trade agreements was now growing into something that no one in the Academy had ever seen before. The holographic display showed changes happening so fast that the alien observers could barely keep up. Emma watched her. Economic models with intense concentration. Numbers flowed across her screens in rivers of data, showing production rates climbing, military spending falling, and trade volumes expanding at an exponential rate. The cascade is accelerating, she announced. Each successful cooperation creates new opportunities for more cooperation. Tom's tactical displays told the same story from a military perspective. Fleet movements that had followed aggressive patterns for 10 years were suddenly shifting toward defensive positions. Supply convoys that had traveled under heavy escort were now moving through space with minimal protection. Most surprising of all, combat encounters between the three factions had dropped to almost zero. The blue faction just withdrew 3 battle groups from the contested Vega sector, Tom reported. They are converting the warships into cargo haulers for the new trade routes. Commander Vel felt his skin pattern cycling through colors he had never experienced before. In 40 years of military service, he had never seen anything like what was happening in the simulation. This is impossible. Military forces do not simply abandon strategic positions without orders from high command. They do when holding those positions becomes economically wasteful, Jake explained. He was monitoring the overall strategic situation, watching as the fundamental nature of the conflict transformed in real time. The simulation's AI has calculated that protecting trade routes produces better results than attacking enemy territories. The alien students pressed against the observation windows, trying to understand what they were witnessing. The Catherian mathematicians were frantically running calculations, trying to verify that the economic changes were mathematically possible. The Zentari warriors stood in confused silence, their honor-based culture struggling to process the idea of victory without battle. Emma pulled up a new display, showing the simulation's resource allocation patterns. The changes were dramatic and accelerating. "Look at this," she said, her voice rising with excitement. "The red faction has increased agricultural production by 67%, just by reallocating resources from military defense to civilian infrastructure. Because they no longer need to defend their agricultural worlds," Tom added. "The trading agreements provide better security than military force ever did." The transformation was happening faster than the humans had predicted. Each faction's AI was discovering that cooperative behavior produced better outcomes than competitive behavior. But more importantly, the AIs were starting to communicate with each other directly, sharing information about trade opportunities and joint development. Projects. Jake highlighted the communication networks on the main display. Direct diplomatic contact between faction leaders for the first time in simulation history, he announced. They are negotiating a mining consortium for the asteroid belt systems. Commander Vel's skin showed the deep blue patterns that indicated he was trying to process information that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. Faction leaders do not negotiate. They are programmed for military conquest, not diplomatic cooperation. They were programmed for military conquest because that was the most efficient way to achieve their goals under the original conditions. Emma corrected. Change the conditions, and the AI changes its behavior to remain efficient. The mining consortium was just the beginning. As the three-faction A's continued their direct communications, they discovered dozens of opportunities for joint projects that would benefit everyone involved. Shared research facilities, combined exploration missions, coordinated infrastructure development across multiple star systems. Tom was monitoring the military situation with growing amazement. Combat fleet strength is down 73%. Across all three factions, he reported. They are converting military vessels to civilian use faster than I can track the changes. Because maintaining large military forces is expensive when there is no one to fight, Jake said. The AI is optimizing for efficiency, and peaceful cooperation is more efficient than military conflict. The cascade effect was becoming visible on every display in the simulation chamber. Star systems that had been battlefields for years were suddenly becoming centers of commerce and industry. Planets that had been strip-mined to support the war effort were being converted to sustainable production facilities. Most remarkably, the three factions were beginning to merge their economies into a single, integrated galactic trading network. Emma's projections showed the future trajectory of the changes. Complete economic integration within the next 20 minutes, she announced. After that, the distinction between the three factions becomes meaningless. The alien observers were struggling to understand what they were witnessing. The simulation had been designed around the premise that three competing powers would fight for dominance until one emerged victorious. But the humans had created conditions where victory came through cooperation rather than conquest. A senior Zentari officer in the observation area finally spoke up. This violates everything we know about warfare. Military forces exist to destroy enemies, not to cooperate with them. Military forces exist to achieve political goals, Jake corrected. Destroy enemies is just one method. It is not the only method, and it is certainly not the most efficient method. Tom pulled up historical data from the simulation's 10-year conflict. Look at the resource expenditure rates during the active war phase. Each faction was spending approximately 40% of their total production on military activities. Now they are spending less than 8% on defense and the remainder on economic development. The result is that all three factions are more powerful now than they were at the height of their military buildup, Emma added. Cooperative development produces better outcomes than competitive destruction. The Academy's computer systems began registering alerts as the simulation approached states that had never been programmed into its original parameters. The software had been designed to model conflict, not cooperation. The rapid changes were pushing it beyond its intended operational limits. Commander Vell checked the system monitors with growing concern. The simulation is approaching theoretical limits. The AI behavior is evolving beyond program parameters. That is exactly what we wanted, Jake said calmly. The simulation's AI is learning that cooperation produces better results than conflict. It is optimizing for success rather than following pre-programmed military strategies. The learning process was accelerating beyond anything the humans had expected. The three-faction A's were not just cooperating. They were actively teaching each other more efficient methods of resource management, production optimization, and infrastructure development. Knowledge that had been jealously guarded during the war phase was now being shared freely between former enemies. Emma's economic models showed the results of this knowledge sharing. Combined research and development efficiency is up 230%. They are solving technical problems in days that would have taken years during the conflict phase. Because they are pooling their intellectual resources instead of duplicating research efforts, Tom explained. Three separate factions working on the same problems is wasteful. One integrated civilization working on shared problems is efficient. The transformation was reaching its final stages. The holographic displays that had once shown three distinct military empires now showed a single, integrated galactic civilization. The artificial boundaries between factions were dissolving as trade networks, communication systems, and development projects created connections that made separation meaningless. Jake stood up and walked to the center of the simulation chamber, where the three faction displays had merged into a single, unified image. "The war is over," he announced quietly. The alien students stared at the displays in stunned silence. 10 years of simulated conflict had ended not with conquest or surrender, but with the simple recognition that cooperation produced better results than competition. The humans had achieved something that military strategists across the galaxy had declared impossible. Commander Vel's skin showed colors that indicated he was experiencing something close to mental overload. "The conflict resolution protocols should be activating," he said in a voice that sounded distant and confused. Emma checked her console and nodded. "Preliminary peace agreements are being drafted automatically by the AI systems. They are structuring the agreements as economic partnerships rather than military treaties. Because economic partnerships are more stable than military treaties," Tom added. "Trade relationships create mutual dependencies that make conflict economically irrational." The simulation chamber filled with alert sounds as the Academy's computers registered the official end of the 10-year war. Lights flashed, status displays changed color, and automated systems began running final calculations on the resolution scenario. But the most remarkable thing was how quiet everything had become. After 10 years of constant battles, space combat, and military movements, the simulation was peaceful. Ships moved through space on trade missions rather than military patrols. Planets focused on production and development rather than defense and warfare. Communication networks carried commercial data and scientific research instead of military intelligence and tactical information. The humans had not just ended the war. They had created the conditions for lasting peace by making peace more profitable than conflict. ****. The silence in the simulation chamber was broken by a single, clear tone from the Academy's main computer system. The sound was followed by a voice that spoke in the formal language used for official announcements. "Conflict resolution achieved. Total simulation time, 57 minutes, 32 seconds. Peace accords have been signed by all participating factions. The grand strategy simulation has been successfully completed." For a moment, nobody moved. The alien students stared at the holographic displays showing the unified galactic civilization that had emerged from 10 years of virtual warfare. Commander Vel stood frozen, his skin pattern cycling through colors that indicated he was trying to process information that his mind could not accept. Then the observation areas erupted in chaos. Catherian students began shouting mathematical equations at each other, trying to calculate how such rapid change was possible. Zentari cadets argued loudly about whether victory through cooperation could be considered real victory at all. Smaller groups from dozens of other species talked excitedly in their native languages, creating a babel of confusion that filled the Academy's halls. Through it all, the three humans remained calm. Jake sat back in his command chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had just completed a routine task. Emma continued studying her economic data, analyzing the final resource distributions with professional interest. Tom leaned against his console and watched the alien reactions with obvious amusement. Commander Vel finally found his voice. "This is impossible," he said, his words barely audible above the noise from the observation areas. "The simulation has been running for 10 years. Hundreds of student groups have attempted resolution. The greatest military minds in the galaxy have studied this problem. And they all approached it as a military problem, Jake said, without looking up from his displays. Military solutions work when the goal is to defeat enemies. But sometimes the goal should be to eliminate the conditions that create enemies in the first place. A senior instructor from the Catherian delegation pushed through the crowd to reach the simulation chamber. Her mathematical mind was clearly struggling with what she had witnessed. You must have found an error in the programming, some kind of exploit or hidden weakness in the code. Emma turned to face the alien mathematician. We can show you every command we entered into the system. Everything we did was within the established parameters of the simulation. But you changed the fundamental nature of the conflict. No, Tom corrected with a smile. We changed the fundamental assumptions about how to resolve conflict. The simulation responded exactly as it was programmed to respond. We just gave it different inputs to work with. The Academy's senior staff began arriving as word of the unprecedented resolution spread through the institution. Instructors who had been teaching military strategy for decades came to see what the humans had accomplished. Administrative officials arrived to verify that the results were legitimate and not the product of some kind of system malfunction. Dr. Thane, the Academy's Director of Strategic Studies, pushed through the crowd with his six-legged gait. His insectoid features showed the rapid antenna movements that indicated extreme agitation. I demand a complete review of the simulation parameters. This result is inconsistent with established military theory. Maybe the problem is with established military theory, Jake suggested mildly. The comment sent shockwaves through the assembled alien instructors. Military theory was the foundation of their entire profession. The idea that humans from a single planet might have insights that challenged galactic military wisdom was difficult for most species to accept. Commander Vell activated the simulation's replay function, allowing everyone to watch exactly what the humans had done. The holographic displays showed their actions in accelerated time, from their initial analysis through their economic interventions to the final peaceful resolution. They treated it like a resource optimization problem, Vell explained to the senior staff. Instead of trying to help one faction defeat the others, they created conditions where cooperation became more profitable than conflict. Dr. Thane's antenna twitched rapidly as he studied the replay data. But this approach ignores fundamental military principles. Territory must be controlled, resources must be secured, enemies must be defeated. Why? Emma asked simply. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dr. Thane opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. After a long moment, he admitted, because that is how warfare has always been conducted. On your worlds, maybe, Tom said. On Earth, we learned that the best way to win a fight is to avoid having the fight in the first place. The alien instructors began talking among themselves in worried voices. The humans had not just solved an impossible simulation. They had done it using principles that challenged the basic assumptions of galactic military education. If the human approach was correct, then everything the Academy taught about warfare might need to be reconsidered. A Zentari war leader stepped forward, his warrior's pride clearly offended by the suggestion that conflict could be avoided. Honorable. Combat is the foundation of civilized society. Without warriors to protect the weak, chaos would consume the galaxy. Jake stood up and faced the alien warrior. Despite being smaller and apparently weaker than the heavily muscled Zentari, there was something about his presence that commanded respect. We are not saying that warriors are unnecessary. We are saying that creating conditions where warriors are not needed is better than creating conditions where they are. You speak like someone who has never faced real combat, the Zentari challenged. I have faced real combat, Jake replied quietly. More than I wanted to. That is why I know that every war that does not happen is better than every war that does happen, no matter who wins. The Academy's computer systems began generating detailed reports on the simulation resolution. The data showed that the humans' approach had not only ended the conflict, but had created the most stable and prosperous galactic civilization that the simulation had ever produced. All economic indicators were positive, all political systems were stable, and all military threats had been eliminated through cooperation rather than conquest. Emma pulled up the final statistics and projected them for everyone to see. Total civilian casualties during our resolution, 0. Economic growth rate of the unified civilization, 347% above pre-war levels. Probability of future conflict based on current conditions, less than 2%. Compare that to traditional military solutions, Tom added, calling up historical data from previous simulation attempts. Average civilian casualties in military resolutions, 43 million. Average economic growth, negative 12%. Probability of future conflict, 86%. The numbers spoke for themselves. The human approach had not only been faster and more efficient, it had produced dramatically better outcomes for everyone involved. Dr. Thane studied the comparative data with the careful attention of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged. If your methods are so effective, why has no other species discovered them? Maybe because no other species comes from a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill them, Jake suggested. When your environment is constantly hostile, you learn to think about survival differently. You learn to look for solutions that other species might not consider. Emma nodded in agreement. Earth taught us that competition and cooperation are not opposites. Sometimes the best way to compete is to cooperate. Sometimes the best way to win is to help everyone else win. 2. Survival thinking versus conquest thinking, Tom added. Most species develop military strategies based on the idea of gaining advantage over enemies. Humans develop strategies based on the idea of surviving regardless of what enemies do. The Academy's announcement system crackled to life, broadcasting the official results to the entire institution. The grand strategy simulation has been completed in a new record time of 57 minutes and 32 seconds. The resolution was achieved by Cadet Team Earth 001 using non-traditional conflict resolution methodologies. The announcement was followed by a moment of galaxy-wide silence as the implications sank in. The simulation that had frustrated military strategists for 10 years had been solved by 3 humans in less than an hour. More importantly, they had solved it using principles that most military academies did not even teach. Commander Vel looked at the 3 humans with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. What will you do now? Jake shrugged with typical human casualness. Go back to Earth, I suppose. Report that the galaxy's military education could use some improvement. The Academy will want to study your methods, Dr. Thane said urgently. We need to understand how you achieved this result. The methods are not complicated, Emma said. Look for solutions that benefit everyone instead of solutions that defeat someone. Think about systems instead of battles. Focus on changing conditions instead of changing outcomes. Tom stood up and stretched, looking completely relaxed despite having just revolutionized galactic military theory. Most importantly, remember that the goal of strategy should be to make war unnecessary, not to make war more efficient. As the humans prepared to leave the simulation chamber, alien students and instructors continued to crowd around the displays, studying the data and trying to understand what they had witnessed. The grand strategy simulation would never be the same. More importantly, galactic military education would never be the same. The 3 humans from the dangerous planet called Earth had taught the galaxy a lesson that would reshape military thinking for generations to come. Sometimes the most effective way to win a war was to prevent the war from being necessary in the first place.